important to mention. I'm not sure how much folks are familiar with that, because that's another improvement we've done between the public preview and GA phase, is that in the What If tool, you can actually click here and get some more additional information about what the user can or can't do. So actually, let me click on the multi-factor, because that will give us a better way to see this. So for the multi-factor authentication, you can see that the user is allowed for SMS and FIDO, and they can satisfy that. But what's cool is that you can also see why they cannot satisfy other combination in the multi-factor authentication. So that gives you a little bit more insight to why a user was or wasn't able to satisfy authentication.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I will be your host for today. My name is Grace Picking, and I am a product manager in the Identity Engineering Customer Experience team at Microsoft. And I am so excited to be joined today by my esteemed colleague and product owner for Auth Strengths, Inbar. Inbar, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hey, Grace. Thank you. Hey, everyone. My name is Inbar Cesar Kobrinsky. I'm a product manager on Microsoft Entra, and I'm focusing on conditional access and authentication method. And today I'm here to talk with you about my favorite feature, which is the intersection between authentication method and conditional access, of course, authentication strengths.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We're so happy that you're here. So before we kick off with this technical look under the hood of all things authentication strengths in Microsoft ID, I want to remind you of what kind of the definition of phish resistance is. And so according to NIST, phishing resistance refers to the ability of an authentication protocol to detect and prevent disclosure of authentication secrets and valid authenticator outputs to an imposter relying party without reliance on the vigilance of the subscriber. And so if you haven't come across this concept before and you want a deeper dive, you can actually take a look at a really great video that also features Inbar. So you can take a look at aka.ms/phish resistant explained to see an amazing session walking through all the technical details of that. So as a reminder, if you have any questions as we're running through this session, please just drop us a comment and we'll get through them as many as we can live. So Inbar, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so happy to have you here to discuss this topic, because as we know, not all MFA methods are created equal. And so I'm really excited to get into the weeds on this and hear from you about kind of the why, the what, and the hows of this feature. So yeah, the stage is yours. Take it away.
Sounds good. I'm just going to share my screen and we'll start. So yeah, I'm here to start talking to you about authentication strengths today, and we'll start with the introduction, just kind of level setting, and what is authentication strengths, why we need it, and then we'll deep dive into the sign-in experience, what actually happens behind the scene when the user signs in, what are we checking to make sure they can use these methods, what happens when they can't use these methods, what's the caveat you need to be aware of. We'll cover troubleshooting as well, what information we provide to administrators in the portal to troubleshoot when a user can't sign in. And we'll finish with some common policies, like how we've seen customers deploying authentication strengths so far and how they have been thinking about it. Okay, let's start. So I wanted to start with a slide that you may have seen before. It's in our documents, and it really describes the differences between the authentication method that we offer in Entra ID. I think that if you're here, you probably know passwords are no longer sufficient to authenticate users. Anything beyond just a password is significantly more secure and reduce the chance of identity compromise. Having said that, as MFA is becoming more and more popular, and it is in the last few years, we're seeing attackers go after MFA and the phishable MFA. And SMS and voice are just no longer sufficient. The other method that we have provide additional capabilities. The Authenticator app, even if we're just using push, provide additional context of the user's location and which application they're trying to access. But eventually, the gold, where we are aspiring to go is the phishing resistant authentication method. And in Entra ID, we offer Windows Hello for Business, certificate-based authentication, and FIDO2 security. These keys, these are our phishing resistant method. So important to keep in mind for this session is that obviously we want anything beyond password, but as we get into the advancing in our MFA journey and MFA deployment, we want to be more specific on which authentication method the user can use and under which circumstances. So authentication strengths 101. As I've mentioned, SMS, voice, they're not as secure as FIDO2, for example, and you may want to protect your most secure resources or your most sensitive resources with the most secure methods. So the example I really like to give in this case is that, for the cafeteria menu, I don't care if my users are going to use password plus SMS. That's fine. Like, guess they'll know, like, and Tecker could know what we serve for lunch today in the cafeteria. But when they access the crown jewels, the sensitive application, this is where I want my users to start using the phishing resistant authentication method. In addition, Grace, you mentioned NIST. So if you're looking at NIST, you're probably aware of the authentication assurance levels, AAL, and those define the difference of requirement for between AL 1, 2, and 3. What are the authentication requirements? What are the enrollment requirements, and so on. And authentication strengths help achieve this, as well as the cafeteria menu versus the sensitive resource scenario. It can be combined with any of the conditions that we have in condition access, and we have a rich set of conditions. So risky users, you can decide that they can only authenticate with more secure methods. Maybe it's based on location. One of the use cases I've heard is that inside the corporate network, users are fine to use less secure methods versus when they're coming from outside. So lots of options and capabilities of authentication strengths with the rich set of conditions we already have in condition access. So let's start with some demos. I'll start with the end user demo, and I want to show you, just a second, let's see how this thing works. Yeah. So we'll see a use case where the user is going into Office application to the Office portal, and they have a simple MFA requirement. This user is registered for both SMS and FIDO. So in this case, we'll see them using password plus SMS when they sign into the Office portal. You can see they have all the options to choose from, but in this case, the user have chosen SMS. Now, the next thing the user is going to do is actually going into the Microsoft Graph Explorer, where we protected MS Graph with phishing resistant authentication method. And you can see that when the user signs in here, they're only shown FIDO. And once the user authenticated, they can sign in. We'll go back later to this example when when we're talking about troubleshooting and what to look at. Okay. So now I'm going to show you a few more things in the Entra portal. Let's see how. Just share the right screen. Yeah. Okay. So this is the authentication strength blade that we have in the Entra portal. You can see here we have 3 built-in authentication strengths. We built it in a way that they're a subset of each other. So multi-factor authentication has all the variation that we support for MFA, versus if you'll go to the phishing resistant, you'll see only Windows Hello, FIDO2, and certificate-based authentication. But of course, if we didn't, met your exact requirement, or there are some additional regulation that you're following, you can create a custom authentication strength and basically choose from the different combination that we support. If you are deep into the FIDO2 journey, we also have advanced options for FIDO2 and allow you to allow specific AA GUIDs for FIDO, which means a specific manufacturer and model. From the conditional access policy side, I'll just quickly show you that here in the grant control, you can see authentication strength and the free built-in option as well as the custom one. Later on, we'll go back to the portal and look at the sign-in logs. Okay, going back to my slides. Let's try that.
So whilst you're doing that, I do also want to shout out, so you were mentioning about the FIDO2 keys. So we do have a list of FIDO2 keys and vendors, which we, as Microsoft, have gone through additional sets of testing above and beyond what they would have gone through just to be deemed FIDO2. So that we basically give them a thumbs up and say, yes, not only are they officially FIDO2, we have gone through the due diligence, tested against our systems and our everything like that, and with our security teams. And yes, that we say that these will work and will be supported by us. So yeah, that's available. I'll dig out the link and I'll get that shared as well. But yeah, that's just one thing to be aware of when you're thinking about FIDO2 and your implementation is, and weighing up vendors and costs and all these sorts of things and functionality. That list is a really good starter for 10 to compare.
Yeah, thanks for that additional input, Grace. Okay, so let's deep dive into the sign-in experience and what are the things we take into consideration and what can happen during sign-in. So on a given sign-in, when the user is accessing a resource, the resource is asking a token for the user. This is when the sign-in actually is evaluated, and conditional access policies, all of conditional access policies are applied during sign-in and evaluated during sign-in, and we obviously enforce the ones that are relevant and met the condition of that particular sign-in. So if authentication strengths was required during sign-in, we check what are the authentication strengths requirements, like which method authentication strengths policy allowed for that specific sign-in. Then we check the authentication method policy, and in the authentication method policy, we check, is the user actually allowed to use this method? Because if the user have been enabled for or is part of a authentication strengths policy that require FIDO, for example, but they're not enabled for FIDO in the authentication method policy, it means that they're unable to use it and unable to register that. So we check that the user is able to use the method. Here, a caveat you need to keep in mind is that we have the new authentication method policy with the nice experience in the Entra portal, and we have the legacy MFA policy, which enable the let's say the traditional MFA method of voice, SMS, software, and hardware auth, as well as push notification. So if you haven't done the steps to migrate from the legacy to the new authentication method policy, now it's a good time to start thinking about it. We have a nice migration steps for you to go from the legacy to the new one. Then we check what the user have registered, because they may be enabled for the method, but they might have not registered the method yet, and that we'll take into consideration when we decide what to do during the sign-in. And lastly, we're checking which method have been used before. So very importantly, we don't want to prompt the user in each and every application that they're going to unless it's required and configured by the admin. So if two different resources required FIDO, as long as the user have used FIDO for the first resource, the next time they're going to their next application, we're not prompting the user again. So we're taking that into consideration. Okay, so what could be the sign-in results? So we have 4 options. Allow access is great, great from end user experience. It means that the user have previously used one of the methods that are allowed to use to satisfy the authentication strength requirement. We don't need to prompt them. We don't need to, interrupt their sign-in, and they're good to go. The other option is we prompt the user for authentication with a different method. So going back to my example with the demo we had, the Office 365 versus the Graphics Explorer example, the user have used SMS. Now they're accessing a different resource that require a different authentication method that they have not used before. They're enabled to the method. They have registered the method, so we can prompt them for that authentication method. The next option is registration. It's possible that the user is capable of using, is enabled for the method, but they've not registered that yet. We'll talk about that in more details in 2 slides. And the last one is block access. Which means the user might have is not enabled for the method, any of the method to satisfy the authentication strength, or some caveats that I will talk about them in more details in a few slides. Okay, so let's deep dive to the different options: the authentication prompt, the registration, and the block options, because the allow access is the simple and straightforward option. So authentication prompt to keep conditional access is evaluated post primary authentication. What it means is that it allows us to that are available as our second factor. Some methods are available in the first and second factor, such as FIDO, the Authenticator Phone Sign-in, temporary pass. Some methods are only available as first factor. Password and Windows for Business are example for that. And for second factors, you can find methods for second factor only. You can find methods like SMS, voice, push notification, etc. We actually have we have that documented in our authentication method documentation. Grace, I actually didn't think about including a link for that. So if you are able to dig this during our session, that's great. If not, I probably can add that later.
Yep.
So going back to the first and second factors, what it means is that, and this is the caveat that you need to keep in mind. So if you want to require Windows Hello for Business, we're able to respect the fact that the user have used Windows Hello for Business in their as primary authentication, but we can't prompt them for Windows Hello for Business as second factor. In this case, and that will go also into the like dead end situation, the user have to actually restart the session and choose Windows for Business. Similarly is password. If you and I've heard some use cases from customers who actually have to enforce password for specific regulations. If the user have used the more advanced option of Windows Hello for Business, for example, they will actually have to restart the session and choose a password to complete and or get access to the resource. And then there are external users, and in external users, there are some caveats you need to keep in mind. First of all, some of the phishing or all of the phishing resistant methods that I've called out, FIDO2, Windows Hello, and CBA, are not supported on the resource tenant. So if they're accessing your tenant, they cannot complete that this method on the resource tenant. But for that, we have the ability to use conditional access authentication strengths in combination with the cross-tenant access setting, where you trust MFA from their home tenant, and you can basically say that if you want, for example, a vendor to access your resource, they have to authenticate on their home tenant with CBA, for example. And then for federated users, we accept basically single factor and multi-factor claims from your external IDP if you're still using federated authentication. Grace, anything you want to add here, or do you have any questions that you want to?
Yeah, so there's one question from the audience and a question from me, but I'll prioritize Chris's question. So Chris Smith on YouTube has asked, are you exploring any QR code based sign-in options as another method on Entra SSO? And the example he's given is Discord allows new device logon by scanning a QR from a trusted device to sign in to exchange credentials passwordless.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't want to talk about roadmap items in this session, given it's a it's a public session, but yeah, I think that's something for us to explore.
Yeah, and I think in terms of what's available now, Chris, if you haven't taken a look yet, it's really worth having a look at our Microsoft Entra Verified ID offering. So that is a really great example of how not only can we do a really beautiful end-to-end authentication experience, it's decentralized verified ID. So you don't necessarily own that credential. That's kept by the user themselves, and that has a QR code auth experience. So definitely worth having a look at that if that's something that you need now. The other question that I had, and this is kind of, thinking out loud in bar, is you've spoken about how if we have this policy set up and the user is required to have a certain strength of authentication method registered, but they don't have it registered, does that mean that if the customer also has a conditional access policy in place that requires register security information to be done, say, on a corporate network, on a trusted device, will that also be respected as part of this registration flow and prompt using auth context? Auth strengths.
Yes, and I think this is a great question because I actually covered this in my next slide. So thank you for that.
Oh, what a beautiful segue. I'll let you carry
Yes,
on then.
which was not planned for the record. Okay, so yeah, let's talk about registration and what it means and what are the caveats there. Um, so going back to the registration, when do we prompt the user to or redirect the user to register a method? So basically, the user is their authentication strengths requirement. It requires some methods. The user is enabled for them in the authentication method policy, but they haven't registered any of the allowed methods. In this case, we redirect the user to the My Security info, the wizard mode. Which is the kind of next experience where they can register multiple authentication method, and we filter this list with the methods that they need to register in order to meet the authentication strengths requirement. So we do want them to be able to register and move on and get access to the resource. So yes, to answer your question, any other conditional access policy for the security info, and in general, and anytime we have multiple conditional access policy applied, this will be applied here as well. So if the user have to register something, but they're coming from outside the corporate network because you don't want to allow registration outside of the corporate network, effectively it means that they're blocked. It means that they need to register a method they have not registered that, and they cannot register when they're outside of the corporate network. So yes, we do respect the different conditional access policies. I actually will talk a little bit more about like what happened when there are multiple conditional access policy applied on the same sign-in. So here's the caveats. Not all the methods are currently available to be registered through the security info wizard mode. What it means is that I'll give an example. So certificate-based authentication, there is no actual user registration. It depends on the admin, pushing a certificate to the user's device, or user is using the smart card. So that depends more on the availability of the certificate on the user side. Windows are for business. You can register this through the Windows UBI experience, or if you're inside Windows already, you can start from the settings and add Windows or for business, but it's not in the wizard mode. Same thing for phone sign-in and FIDO2. They can be registered either for phone sign-in, you can register it from the Authenticator app. FIDO2 is you can register it from the security info from the edit mode. So this is there are things that we're working on improving this area, but it's important to keep in mind that if you want to start deploying the phishing resistant methods or the passwordless method, make sure that the users register in advance, so they're not basically getting stuck in this in the wizard mode without being able to move forward. And we do provide this information during the sign-in, in the wizard mode, for the users, what they can do to register those methods. Lastly, any other registration policies like the self-service password reset, or if you are using the identity protection registration requirement, these would still apply. Like if you have both of them applied on the same sign-in as authentication strength, these will all show up for the user, the relevant method in the wizard mode. Grace, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. And I've actually just we've just had a question from PB, and they ask, is it correct that CBA, certificate-based authentication with external users, even in the MFA trust, is enabled, and they do it in their home tenant is not supported? So to answer your question, we are bringing more authentication methods and scenarios based on customer feedback. So that scenario is not currently supported, but that's really interesting feedback and insight. So thanks very much. Watch this space.
Wait, I want to double click on it just to make sure. If you want to require CBA with authentication strengths, and you do enable the cross-tenant setting to trust the MFA from the home tenant, then yes, the user is redirected back to the home tenant, and they can use CBA and then access the resource on the resource tenant. So that scenario is supported. The nuance here is that if you want the user to use certificate-based authentication on the resource tenant, that's something that is not currently available.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. That's great nuance there. And then we've also had a question from Eric, which is it possible to authenticate from certain mobile devices through certificates or keys?
Yes. So customers, we actually have like a nice solution where customers can use a security key and put on the security key. In addition to being FIDO capable, they can be pushing a certificate to that device, and that can be used to authenticate on the mobile device with a certificate. But otherwise, customers can push certificate to the mobile device through MDM solutions.
Great, awesome, thank you, and thanks for that question, Eric. That was a great question. So yeah, let's see what you've got next for us, Inbar.
Cool. Okay, so let's talk about blocking access, and that's where things get interesting, unless they were interested until now. So first of all, the user is not allowed to use any of the methods that are required by authentication strength. That straight up, block, you can't access the resource, you're not enabled for those methods. And here's a few of the caveats. I've mentioned this before, like if the user have choose the wrong, and I'm putting wrong in quotes because it's more of like a user experience issue, which is like if they chose, let's say, password, but they had to use Windows or for Business, we have to ask them the user have to restart the session and have to choose Windows or for Business in order to get to the right resource. Mentioned it in the previous slide. If they didn't register a passwordless method, they have to register this outside of the next experience, and they have to actually take their phone and register the passwordless method, the phone sign-in, or if it's CBA, making sure they have the certificate and so on. And finally, I mentioned FIDO2 security key advanced option before. So if you are using FIDO2 key advanced option to restrict to specific manufacturer and model, and the user have used a different key, they have to restart their session and choose the right key, assuming they have it. So these are the cases where we block access. I wanted to, before I go to troubleshooting, I want to add a few more things. So this is the multiple condition access policies. So on all sign-ins, all condition access policies apply, and all authentication strength, if you have multiple authentication strengths requirement, there will all apply. So if you have, for example, requirement for multi-factor authentication strengths and phishing resistant authentication strengths, user have to satisfy both. If they start with using password plus SMS, they would still have to satisfy the phishing resistant method, and then they will have to use FIDO. If they just use FIDO to begin with, then they satisfy both the MFA and the phishing resistant, so will not prompt them again. So if you have a custom authentication strengths which have completed two set of credentials, one custom authentication strength with just FIDO, one custom authentication strength with just passworded SMS. In this case, the user will actually have to satisfy both authentication strengths requirement. Will have to do password and SMS. Will have to do FIDO in order to gain access to the resource. What happened when we're talking about security info, and that goes a little bit back to the previous slide when you asked me about the multiple policies applied. In security info, if you have a policy that for all apps, let's say to require any method except temporary access pass. This is a use case we've seen from quite a few customers. So they want to allow in all of their application, they want to allow everything but temporary access pass. And then for registering a method, they want to allow either temporary access pass or FIDO2. So you can register a method if you're using TAP, or if you already have a key, you can register another key. In this case, and only in this case, we'll prefer the security info, the authentication strengths that applied only for the security info. Because that allows us to actually enable customers to go and register the FIDO2 key or with temporary access pass and then move on to all of their applications. Important to mention that all the conditional access policies and requirement applies as usual. This is just specific case that we enable for registration to allow temporary access pass for registration versus using all other methods to all other resources. And finally, for external users, I've mentioned that before, and Grace, you actually asked me about a question about that. If you're using, if you want to enable users for the phishing resistant and passwordless method, you have to use authentication strengths with the combination of cross-tenant access settings, trust MFA from their tenant, but then you can be very specific on which method they have to use. So you can say they have to use CBA on the resource on their home tenant in order to access the resource tenant. So Grace, before we go to troubleshooting, anything you want to add?
Oh my gosh, yes. So we've had a really great question from Mark prior, but before I come to his question, I just kind of want to speak to you a little bit about you know, being a customer or an identity product owner for this. There's a lot of things at play here. You've mentioned multiple conditional access policies. You've mentioned registering security information settings, even the combined registration experience, plus what methods a user can use. You know, all of these things together. What I'm hearing is it's really important that if I'm thinking about deploying and leveraging authentication strengths, that before I do that, I have a good understanding of what my current configuration is and user experience for multi-factor authentication and registration, as well as is that what we intended initially based on our risk appetite and our security policies, so that you can then, you know, implementing authentication strengths, because you know, before you move into trust, obviously going to help if you do see issues. I think, you know, if you want to start off in a good position, it's really important for, you know, our customers and our partners, you know, people that are thinking about this in their organizations, is you need to understand where you're starting from. And is that in line with what you want? And what's your end goal going to be? Because there is a lot of things at play here. And they're all really important to make sure you've got right, because you don't want to block access unnecessarily, and equally, even worse, you don't want to allow access without having the suitable controls in place. Which takes me to Mark Pryor's question, which is, have blocked error messages improved yet? So the example he's given is, you know, using an unsupported method or hitting an unsupported condition would be an extremely generic message without related context. Usually you can't access this right now, rather than you must use passwordless or FIDO sign-in. So from your perspective, when you're seeing this, have we adjusted or made any improvements in our error messaging to the end users to help them understand a little bit more about why they may not be getting where they want to, or are being asked to register or blocked?
Yes, 100%. And thanks for this feedback. I appreciate it, and we definitely heard it from customers. So a few things we've done between the public preview and GA, and if you haven't checked it since GA, it might worth coming back to it. So from the end user perspective, during sign-in, again, if they're choosing, for example, password instead of Windows Hello for Business, and we need them to restart the session, yes, we have added, updated the error message to say which method they have to use. And then if the user is getting into the wizard mode, but they cannot register methods, we've also updated that description to be more specific on, like, okay, if you want to go to register FIDO, you need to do this. If you need CBA, you actually need to contact your admin for, for putting a certificate. Contact your admin. I'll say, in order for them to put a certificate on your on the machine, and so on. So there are more end user messages or strings, end user facing message, but we're always open to feedback, and if you think we can improve, I'm happy to hear that as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think also with end user facing error messages, it's this really hard balancing act between giving them enough information so that they can remediate and self-heal or know who to contact, versus not just giving them error codes, but also something that's slightly obfuscated or doesn't potentially expose an organization's security configuration, which even the simplest of information, even if it's not a giving you technical details, could give somebody, if they were trying to socially engineer somebody, could give them more insight. So that's where we've always got to tread that fine line between, usability, functionality, and security. And error messaging, especially for authentication strengths for multi-factor authentication, we've got to be so careful. So yeah, really appreciate the feedback there. And as you can see, we've factored in some better messaging, but yeah, we're always up for hearing more feedback if you've got it about this, with that in mind, that you don't want to potentially give away too much insight to help your end users when you could be potentially helping adversaries.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with that. That's in every error message we try to balance end user and not exposing too much information for adversaries. So 100% agree on that.
Yeah. So talking about all that error message and everything, let's move on to troubleshooting. How can our customers, look at this behind the scenes and under the hood when it's being deployed?
So I'm going to try to share my screen, my browser. Let's see, just a second.
Also, shout out to Jeff, our producer on the show today.
Okay, can you see the screen? I think it works.
Yeah, we can see the browser.
Cool. So going back to the Entra ID portal, I'm in the sign-in logs. I reproduce the sign-in that we had in the video earlier for the user who access MS Graph and get the FIDO requirement. So I wanted to call out a few things that you can find in the sign-in logs. So first of all, under the authentication details, you can see here the authentication strengths requirement that were applied on the sign-in. Here you would see the method that the user have used. If it was an interactive sign-in, the user was prompted for authentication. We have here under the authentication policies applied authentication strength. And if you go to the conditional access policy, the conditional access blades, you will see here if the method, if it was satisfied, if it wasn't satisfied. We add a little bit more information here so you can check that. The other thing that I wanted to mention, I'm not sure how much folks are familiar with that, because that's another improvement we've done between the public preview and GA phase, is that in the what if tool, you can actually click here and get some more additional information about what the user can or can't do. So actually, let me click on the multi-factor, because that will give us a better way to see this. So for the multi-factor authentication, you can see that the user is allowed for SMS and FIDO, and they can satisfy that. But what's cool is that you can also see why they cannot satisfy other combination in the multi-factor authentication. So that gives you a little bit more insight to why a user was or wasn't able to satisfy authentication method. Okay, going back to my slides.
So then back to what I was saying about, make sure you understand your existing configuration for conditional access policies and registering, that the what if tool is a great first step of, when you're doing these thought experiments, before you put anything into a test tenant or production, you can run your kind of models through what if, and see what the outcome is going to be, and then make adjustments, or go ahead with your next step of deployment. I think that's something that's really, really valuable for our customers and our admins, to give that, that first step before, pressing buttons and, all that kind of stuff. It gives them that kind of sanity check, if you will, or four eyes view of, right, we have thought about this, because sometimes they can be quite complex things to walk through in your mind, especially with conditional access being post auth, and then you've got registration flow. What if really helps flush out that detail and the end result, without you having to implement anything just yet.
Yeah. One more thing I should have probably added to the slides, but we can add later, is that before the deployment, and if you want to check registration, we have under authentication methods in the Entra portal, we have the usage and registration report. So you can actually see, how many users have registered specific methods, and also you would be able to see usage over time once you actually deploy authentication strength, as well as the conditional access monitoring. I actually have a screenshot for that, so I'll show that in a second. I'll jump here on these two, which I just showed you. Yeah, in the conditional access blade under monitoring, you actually can filter the sign-ins based on the different authentication strengths and see which sign-ins were enforced for or were in scope for authentication strengths. So that's more on the monitoring once you enable. But before you enable, you can go to the authentication method registration and usage report to see are my users are ready to start using that. Okay. So
before,
yeah.
sorry, Inba, before we jump into common policies, we've had an interesting question from Chris Smith. He said, is just FIDO2 keys considered phishing resistant MFA, or does Microsoft Authenticator plus phone sign-in count? Or which methods or combos are considered phishing resistance versus authentication strength, which is obviously an interesting concept. And I know we touched on that in the other video. Do you have a short answer for that question?
Yeah, our phishing resistant method are FIDO2, Windows RAW, and CBA. The passwordless phone sign-in offers a great user experience, provided context, provided the obviously not using a password, but it's not phishing resistant, because even with all of that, you could still, try to social engineer the user. But this is another area where we're working on improvements.
Yeah, and thanks very much for that question, Chris, because it is very important to hone in on that. Before it was just like, oh, well, single factor is good, but MFA is better. Now there's like different nuances of good, better, best in MFA. And even within that, there's now another layer. So it's great to make sure that if you are consuming NIST guidelines or policies, and you're working with your risk teams to understand from a technical perspective what those are defined as. And I remember the first time I came across this concept of phish resistance, I said phish proof, and oh my god, the face that it was actually Tarek. So shout out Tarek in our architecture team. It was like Anehu, they were like, there's no such thing as phish proof, we say phish resistant. And I was like, okay, so I'll never make that mistake again. So I'm sharing that boo-boo here so that all of you don't repeat via embarrassment. But the other thing I wanted to add about the audit logs and everything is when obviously identity teams and people that own the feature set or whatever it is within their organization, however it's split out operationally, make sure with something like this, if you're looking at changing your conditional access policies and implementing authentication strengths, don't do that in a vacuum. Make sure you engage end user communications teams, your release management teams, and most importantly, SecOps and also your help desk or support desk, because these are new audit logs and these are new things which, you know, for example, your SecOps team may need to make sure they're in your SIEM system, or they're monitoring them in Sentinel, and they know when to flag if an end user has hit a bit of a wall, or if that's, you know, if it's genuine, they are trying to access something and they don't have the right credential available to them to access that, or they don't meet the requirements, versus it actually being somebody trying to get in. And same with the help desk, is because we've changed the error messaging and there is new experience for the user, make sure you bring all these teams along on the ride with you, so that again it helps, you know, when you are rolling things out, making sure everyone's aware of what's going on, and you know, it saves your inbox being on fire, for example, if people don't know what's going on, or if SecOps suddenly starts seeing all these alerts and additional logs. You know, don't forget about everybody else. I'm sure you won't, but it's hard when you think about these that can be so technically deep and complex to, you know, bring the rest of your IT and operations and company with you.
Yeah,
so
100%.
So with that, let's talk about some of the common policies that we see recommended and kind of needed by our customers.
Okay. So I wanted to share something. I've seen different versions of it from customers, but just kind of how customers are thinking about this. This aligns with the authentication assurance level from this. But the idea is that dividing the resources and applications that you have in your tenant by their sensitivity. So low, medium, high is obviously is one example, and then you can apply different access requirement. It can be putting as authentication strengths for us aside for a second. You can require device to be compliant. You can require specific locations or skip MFA from inside the corporate network and so on, based on the sensitivity of the app. And now that we have app filters in conditional access, it actually makes it much easier to manage all these applications escape, because you don't have to go and edit the conditional access policy every time you onboard a new application to your tenant. If you tag them with the custom security attributes accordingly, the conditional access policy will just apply on the next time your users are starting to sign in. And then come authentication strengths. So it could be that you want to do MFA or non-telecom MFA for low and medium, or maybe you want to do non-telecom MFA all up, because that's an opportunity for you to start getting away from SMS and voice. And for the more secure applications, using the phishing resistant. And that's also kind of aligned with the example I gave at the beginning of the session of the cafeteria menu versus your sensitive resources. And then you'll have policies that are cross applications. So you want to block users because for risky sign-in or risky users, you want to block them all up, no matter which application they're accessing. We've talked about this earlier, about the idea of using temporary access for bootstrap and recovery. Every time you go into to security info, you can register your method either with one of your existing method or with temporary access pass, versus allowing other authentication methods for all other resources you have in the tenant, and that requires using custom authentication strengths. I'll talk about it in my next slide in a little bit more details. And then with PIM that now support authentication context, you can say for elevating for a privileged role, the user must use phishing resistant authentication method. And of course, I've heard multiple customers telling me that they started using authentication strengths with the cross-tenant access settings to make sure that their vendors are accessing not just using MFA, but using phishing resistant methods. I wanted to a little bit deep dive into the temporary access pass example, just to be a little bit more clear on that. So what does it require if you do want to allow tap for bootstrap and recovery while allowing all other methods for all other resources? It means that you want to create a custom authentication strengths for temporary access pass and phishing resistant MFA methods, and create another custom authentication strength, or just use the existing phishing resistant MFA or passwordless MFA built-in strength. And then conditional access, you create one application that targets all apps, for example, and then another one that targets the register security info action, the user action, with the custom authentication strength that does a lot of temporary extras. So that's another use case I've seen from quite a few customers, and I've seen that for registering methods. Also, Intune enrollment is another one that I've seen. To allow tap for into enrollment. So these are the things that we've seen. This is it for me, except for a few links. Grace, what do you think?
Oh God, my tiny mind is buzzing thinking about all the scenarios that I've heard over the years from customers and from deployment partners and everything like this about this. I'm thinking about scenarios for admins for making sure, we can lock down to SOAR devices with phish-resistant credentials to certain network locations. And then you're talking about, well, not just your admins, you've got your end users and your vendors and the location of devices. And then, wow, you've got TAP as well. Oh, it's beautiful. And I think that because obviously I'm getting very carried away very quickly thinking about all my customers' different scenarios over the years, but I think definitely these common policies are a great place to start, because they're kind of solution agnostic as it is industry kind of. You always should be looking after your high privilege admin accounts, your high what should we say, your VIPs, for lack of a better term, your highly targeted people. Make sure that you're not trying to potentially boil the ocean, as the term goes. Evaluate what your configuration is now, have a play around with the what if, think about those common policies, and use that, as we would say in the UK, a starter for 10 to think about, okay, well, for us, with our locations, our devices, and our zero trust framework, what would our policies look like? And then, because you're using it in conditional access, you can put them in report only, add in groups of users, target, even use device tagging and auth context as well. There's 1,000 million options, but yeah, I think it's really important that have a think about it, understand what you've got now, test it out with what if, and then trial it. And then, again, you can keep going back and monitoring your adoption through the workbooks that are available and the auditing logs. So yeah, no, I'm, as you can tell, very excited about the concept. So yeah, I mean, thank you so much for sharing this with us. So in terms of the go-dos for our viewers then, so I'd say take a look at these documents. So we've got an overview and some of the technical details that we've mentioned today, or all of them, I think, are in our Authentication Strengths docs. So you can find that at aka.ms/authstrengthdocs. It's also accessible using an API if you're that way inclined, rather than a portal button clicker. So that's available at aka.ms/authstrengthAPI docs. And if you want to learn more about the world of phish resistance and the definition, have a look at the amazing video available at aka.ms/phish-resistant-explained to understand that in more depth. Before I close, Inbar, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
No, just thanks for having me. It's been fun sharing, more on the feature that I love so much. And yeah, I appreciate the feedback as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So thank you to you, Inbar. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your amazing feature set with us. Thank you to our viewers for tuning in. If you're watching back, feel free to drop us a comment with any of your questions or feedback. We do genuinely love to hear from you. And if you start rolling this out, let us know. We love to see it. As you can tell, we thrive on this stuff. So without further ado, thank you so much. Don't forget to take a look at our upcoming events here on the 425 show. Next Thursday, we've got a technical deep dive into verified ID, which I am also hosting, so apologies in advance. And then our monthly update, which also includes me, oh my God, busy woman, trying to make the most out of my new camera, on the 4th of October, where we'll run through the latest updates in Microsoft Entra for the month of September. So I don't know where the year's gone, but yes, Thank you so much for joining. Thank you to Chris and Mark and everyone that submitted questions. Thank you to Imbar, and thank you to Jeff behind the scenes. And it's good night and goodbye from me.